Hello everyone, good morning or good afternoon. My name is Robert Luna, and today we're going to be talking about the biting midges, the Ceratopogonidae, also known as the biting midges. And we're going to be talking about how, how they do the reproduction, where they typically live, and as far as their habitat, how do they live exactly, what do they do, and and we'll talk about other things as well as far as the life cycle and things like that. So the Ceratopogonidae, right? So the Ceratopogonidae, also known again as the biting midges, have other names to them, but they are considered a family of biting flies. So this family can live in multiple regions, such as in coastal areas, to the high Arctic, to islands, or even in areas with little moisture, such as when it comes to the immature. So the immatures of these flies, they really require moisture because it kind of helps the development in the life cycle. Now, although these flies can cause harm to animals and humans, they're essential in the ecosystem. Some species in this family are considered pollinators, as an example, like the cacao plant. So basically, in a sense, without the help of these flies, the spread of the pollination of the cacao plant wouldn't be continuing or wouldn't be a consistent thing, which is pretty interesting. They can also be deadly to other insects and caterpillars due to having other diseases they can transmit. And as we all know, in some certain insects and caterpillars can also transmit diseases to uh, the plants, the crops, and so that's also kind of a beneficial thing to farmers, especially. Like in a lot of vectors, people don't know 100% of the diseases this family can transmit. So this family in particular is the least understood compared to other vectors. It can transmit a lot of diseases, but we lack the knowledge of these diseases. And we've also talked about this before in the past, where there's a lot of vectors out there, or I should say, there's a lot of diseases out there that the vectors that we do know we don't really know what all the diseases, all the possibilities that these vectors can transmit. And so the knowledge of that hopefully should increase in the future. Okay, so uh, as you can see in table 10.1, there are different taxa, vectors, hosts, and locations. Specifically, there are different organisms transmitted by Ceratopogonidae. So as you guys can see, again, you have the table here. Um, Honestly, in the chapter in the book, there's 3 pages dedicated to this table. So it kind of keeps going on through multiple taxa, like the viruses you guys can see there, but there's also the protozoa, the bacteria, and things like that. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because it's a big table, but you guys can see there, you have the taxa, the vector, the vertebrate hosts, different types of hosts, and you can kind of see some of them, a good chunk of them are birds, mammals, marsupials, rodents, things like that, or organisms like that, and also know the locations as well. Okay, so as far as the taxonomy, the phylogeny of the Ceratopogonidae, it's quite interesting. So here, this is figure 10.1. So previously was a table 10.1. This is figure 10.1. You can see the 5 subfamilies of Ceratopogonidae. Only some genera in these subfamilies do bite, including the Leptoconops, the Astroconops, the Forcipalmia, and the Culicoids. If I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, I'm sorry, but I think that's the way you pronounce it. The other genera either feed on other insects or don't bite at all. We're actually going to go a little bit in detail when it comes to vertebrate biters and invertebrate biters later on in the presentation. So the book mentions that Ceratopogonidae is the only family of biting flies where distribution maps and keys to all North American pest species, for some reason, they don't exist. So like the first bullet says there, that basically all the maps and the keys that can locate certain flies or mosquitoes or whatever you're talking about, when it comes to the Ceratopogonidae, apparently it's the only family of biting flies that doesn't exist. So the only ones you can kind of find, the best ones you can find is the Leptoconops and the Culicoids in only certain states. And to be honest, the chapter doesn't really specify which states in the country, so that'll be pretty interesting to know uh, and see what exactly, uh, where do these flies come from, right? Or I'm sorry, do they spread? So there are certain species complexes that do require some resolution to determine the identity of the pest species. So in the year 2000, a paper reported to have resolved a North American species group that includes the vector that has or contains blue tongue, which is from the vector C. sonorensis. A problem though that has been happening. So basically, they were just trying to find the specific group in North America that was spreading the blue tongue, and it was obviously later on it was the vector C. sonorensis. Another problem is comparing specimens from different regions will reveal that in some independently named taxa, they can belong to the same exact species. C. obsoletus has been named 14 times based on information from 8 different countries, as an example, as you guys can see there. Um, and so that was pretty interesting to see as far as reading that part of the chapter. Like it was kind of shocking to me. So it was kind of interesting to share. Now, as you guys can see here, um, the book mentions that there needs to be, well, the book does mention, let me go back to this. It does mention that there needs to be more phylogenetic studies that can be better understood when it comes to the biology, the anatomy of the biting midges or the Ceratopogonidae. So in this figure, we have the female adult culicoids on the left side, detailing where the mandible is or the labrum is. So you guys can see they're kind of like basically almost in the center, or at least the labrum is in the center. The structures of the adult female Leptoconops and the Leptoconops larvae as well. So you can also kind of see it on the right side. That's basically where I'm talking about. And um, the Leptoconops have anterior radial cells compacted into a thickened unit. So it's an elongated R. It's basically the wings are basically different compared to other species uh, of different biting flies. So that's what they're pretty much what they're trying to explain here. Um, and specifically, let me mention this: the Ostraconops, which is, you can barely see it, but on the very bottom on the right side, it's part C, I believe, and it's the Ostraconops wing. So the Ostraconops have a distinctive wing venation, which is shown in this figure. So basically, the wingspan of this particular species is kind of like more longer. Basically, it's basically more longer compared to, I believe it was the culicoids, yes, and the leptoconops as well. Okay. So like I was mentioning earlier, the vertebrate versus the invertebrate biters. So for the biting midges, there are two types of biters, one for vertebrates and one for invertebrates. Vertebrate feeders or biters have finely toothed mandibles in order to cut through the host and the lacinae with re with re-toothed teeth in order to hold the mouth parts in place. So, excuse me. Basically, the vertebrate biters or feeders, they basically have specific parts in their mouth where they can kind of latch on and kind of basically bite, compared to the biting midges of the invertebrate feeders or the biters have coarsely toothed mandibles and simple lacinae. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. So the female adults of Forcipamia also have well-developed radial cells, but they lack the R4+5. So on the previous on the other figure that I mentioned with the wingspan, they do have an R4+5, which was what the book kind of mentions with the figure. But here you don't see an R4+5. Over here you basically just kind of see an R3 on the left side there. They have 13 antennal flagellum with an episternal suture and have short cerci. The adult females of culicoids, which is on the right side, also have well-developed radial cells. They also lack an R4+5, also have 13 antennal flagellomeres, very similar to the adult females of Forsypomia. So they're both kind of similar to as far as the wingspan and things like that. Now, throughout this section of the book, as far as the rest of the morphology, the biology of the flies here, the book talks about more about the morphology of the Ceratopogonidae in particular, specifically the pupae of both Ceratopogonidae and Forsypominae. The pupae for Ceratopogonidae have a pair of respiratory organs on their thorax to obtain air, their anterior portion of their bodies facing the air. So basically their front faces the air, right? And their back is on the water. But if they're in, for some reason, on aquatic surfaces. But the aquatic species, they can either be floating at the surface with the apices of the respiratory organs, making contact with the air, or partially emergent above the water level. Okay. Now, the pupae of Forsypominae pupate communally with their heads abutting or closely associated and their abdomens pointing outward. Okay, so that's just a little bit of information about how, as far as how they get the air, the oxygen, and specifically the aquatic species. Okay, so now the life cycle of many species in Ceratopogonidae takes about a year, but in favorable conditions like warm temperature is a big one, may take us about 2 weeks from the egg to adult, and also for the multivoltine species. Some Arctic species likely take at least about 2 years to complete their life cycle. So yeah, and basically that's the life cycle of the Ceratopogonidae. Basically about 2 weeks, especially with the warm temperatures. Okay, so when it comes to the habitat, all biting midges are typically in aquatic, semi-aquatic, or merely very moist habitats. The immatures require moisture in order to survive, like I was previously mentioned in the beginning. As far as the immatures of Ceratopogonidae, they're found in a large diversity of habitats, so they love to go in different places. From rotting vegetation and manure to lakes and rivers. So they can go through all those different types of habitats and environmental conditions. The immatures of Leptoconops can be found in wet or damp sand or even in sandy soil near fresh water or marine beaches. And I forgot to mention that basically in the chapter, they kind of mentioned different families or species of, as far as how these different types of flies, these different types of biting midges live in their habitat and where exactly, what type of environmental conditions specifically they mention here. With the immatures of Ostraconops, they typically live in wet soils. The larvae and pupae of only 13 species of Forsypomia have been described to live with mosses and algae growing on wood or soil, which is pretty interesting. Because if only 13 species of these specific family are only described to live on mosses and algae on wood, what about the other species, right? So that's pretty interesting to know and curious to see what about the other species of this family live in. Now, as far as they reproduce, this is pretty interesting as far as what I read here in the chapter. So when adults begin to emerge, the males would want to mate in order to have successful reproduction, right? So typically the males are in swarms and they fly together until a female just kind of passes through. The male is attracted to the female by the wing beat that the female gives off and even the pheromones as well that the female gives off. And I believe we also did this part of the chapter kind of ties into, I believe it was chapter 41 that talked about the pheromones of the female. So it was pretty interesting to see that. Interestingly, the males are able to twist so this is the part that was kind of like interesting, right? The males are able to twist their genitalia 180 degrees so that the flying or resting couple will face away from each other when reproducing or when mating. This generally takes a few minutes. The males produce and insert a two-chambered spermatophore into the female genitalia, and the sperm is released to find the female spermatothecate. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, I'm sorry. But all of that is happening as they're mating midair. If I'm correct. The females then find a blood meal right after to develop their eggs, which are called the anatogenous. Females that don't require a blood meal after reproduction are called autogenous. So it's pretty interesting. Now, going back to vertebrate biters versus invertebrate biters, the book kind of compares them again. So vertebrate biters tend to find a suitable host by tracking the CO2 produced by the host. For a biting site, they like to have sites from a certain height off the ground. For example, the book mentions culicoids phlebotomous, which basically, they suck the blood from humans on beaches, specifically from the knees down. They're vectors of Dipetalonema, Ozardi, which is a filarial worm in humans. They can, feed on leatherback turtles as they're laying the eggs. So that's why I included the picture of a leatherback turtle laying the eggs. And there's just another picture there of, as far as seeing a visual of what the biting midges can do, specifically here in a hand. Invertebrate biters are hard to decipher, especially to look for. When it comes to knowing how they find their host, only some species of Atrichopogon can find their host by being attracted by cantharidin and vision from females. At least that's what the book says. Okay. Oh, and I forgot to mention real quick. Some species of females in Ceratopogonidae feed on vertebrates like lizards, birds, mammals, kangaroos, humans, frogs, and toads. Ostraconobs specifically feed on the humans. The book does mention that specifically. Sometimes the females go into a male swarm, starts to mate with a male, and then pierces the male's head and sucks up the content, which was very, very shocking and interesting to know. This happens in members of Heteromyini, Spheromyini, and Palpomyini. I forgot to mention that earlier, and I apologize you get to see that. But the book does mention that, which is kind of interesting to know. Now, as far as the eggs, after a blood meal, females do need time to develop their eggs. In that case, they need to find a suitable habitat. So they can bury themselves, the sand, like what the Leptoconobs do, or like what the Ceratopogonidae do, which can rest on surrounding vegetation. And as far as how many eggs, females can lay up to from 30 eggs to 450 eggs, depending on what particular species you are talking about. When it comes to habitat, though, the species of Ceratopogonidae that typically live in temporary habitats tend to disperse more broadly. So they don't like to spend their time all the time in one area. They kind of do tend to branch out. Compared to those that have permanent habitats, they just stay closer to that one habitat. Okay. So biting midges can cause pain in the bite and illness. A large number of bites can lead to infections due to scratching by the host. This can also affect cattle, horses, birds, etc., right? Sheep even. Most of the diseases that biting midges can transmit don't have a huge significance on human health, but there are some that can do. And just real quickly, as an example here, in Costa Rica, there are about 148 species of culicoids, but only 12 have been recorded to bite humans. And out of those 12, only 3 are considered to be very serious for humans. Okay. And so, for an example, as far as humans, the Aropoch virus, it's an example of a serious pathogen. It can cause flu-like symptoms like fever, vomiting for about 2 weeks. Known from the vector C. pararensis. Another example for cattle or for horses specifically, the African horse sickness is another one. Blue tongue, epizootic hemorrhagic disease, the Acabane virus are all examples that affect cattle. Okay. Now, as far as real quickly to mention the control efforts, there's some things like the flooding scheme, the crude oil, chlorinated hydrocarbons. At first, that was the beginning as far as how they would control the flies, but they eventually led to the chemical like DEET. It's a good repellent to get rid of biting midges. Windy areas, moving water, wearing light clothing, livestock being outside where there's wind. Finally, screen windows that can be that can have some type of DEET or some type of repellent to get these flies away from them. And currently, right now, uh, as far as future research, the book does mention that there is some promising research on biological control agents, but there hasn't been a lot of that against Ceratopogonidae. But there has been some research regarding larvicides and adulticides. Um, the authors here in this paper do test their larvicides and the adulticides on treated farms with specifically culicoids, and they did see a decrease in the culicoid population on those treated farms. All right, so these are the references, and thank you. Hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you all in class.